History remembers Bunker Hill as a British victory. And technically, that's true. The British captured the hill. The Americans retreated. Mission accomplished. But when the smoke cleared, Britain's generals weren't celebrating. They were counting the bodies. More than 1,000 of the king's finest soldiers had fallen to an army of colonial volunteers. In a single afternoon, Britain won the battle and lost the illusion that America would be easy to conquer. This story is not really about a hill. It is about a belief that Britain carried into June 17, 1775, and never carried out of it. What was that belief? What broke it? And why did it matter more than the battle itself? Stay with this, because by the end of this story, you will never look at the American Revolution the same way again. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now. Every video on this channel is the story underneath the story, and this one starts in Boston. Boston in the spring of 1775 was a city under siege, but not in the way you might expect. The British were not besieging Boston, they occupied it. Thousands of redcoat soldiers patrolled its streets. Warships controlled its harbor. General Thomas Gage ran the colony from his headquarters like a military governor. Soldiers drilled on the Boston Common, while residents watched from behind closed shutters. Checkpoints at every major intersection. Armed patrols along the waterfront. Artillery batteries covering the harbor approaches. But the city was surrounded. After Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, colonial militias from across Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire had poured toward Boston and established a ring of encampments on the hills and farmland surrounding the peninsula. The British held the city. The colonists held everything else. It was a stalemate. And stalemates, by definition, cannot last. Gage understood that his position in Boston was strategically weak. The peninsula sat in a harbor surrounded on three sides by water. The British controlled that water with their navy, but the high ground, the hills on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north, and the Dorchester Heights to the south, commanded the harbor from above. If either of those positions fell into colonial hands and were armed with artillery, the British fleet and the British garrison would both be exposed. Gage was planning to move first. He intended to send troops to occupy those heights before the colonists could. He made the mistake of telling his officers before he moved. One of them told someone else. That person told someone who told someone who told the colonial commanders. The colonists moved first. On the night of June 16, 1775, roughly 1,200 colonial militiamen received a set of orders that most of them found somewhere between audacious and suicidal. They were to march to the Charlestown Peninsula under cover of darkness, occupy the high ground, and build a fortification capable of withstanding British attack. All before dawn, all in silence, with the British fleet anchored less than a mile away in the harbor. The officers in charge were Colonel William Prescott, a Massachusetts farmer who had fought in the French and Indian War and carried himself with the steady authority of a man who had seen worse situations than this one, and Colonel Israel Putnam of Connecticut, a grizzled veteran in his 50s whose reputation for physical courage was the kind that soldiers either believed completely or considered exaggerated. In Putnam's case, the reputation was accurate. There was supposed to be a third commanding presence. Brigadier General Joseph Warren, the most prominent civilian leader of the Massachusetts Patriot movement, a physician whose speeches and writings had helped turn public opinion toward revolution, had ridden to the battlefield that morning and asked Prescott to fight under his command rather than the other way around. Warren had no military experience. Prescott had the commission, but Warren wanted to be where the fighting was. He would not survive the day. The colonial force marched quietly through the darkness, crossed onto the Charlestown Peninsula, and began to dig. The plan had originally been to fortify Bunker Hill, the larger and more defensible of the two hills on the peninsula. Somewhere in the night, the decision was made to build instead on Breed's Hill, which was lower, closer to Boston, and far more exposed. This was, by any rational military assessment, the wrong choice. Breed's Hill was closer to the British guns, harder to defend, and easier to surround. But it was also directly visible from Boston, directly visible from the British fleet, directly visible from every window in every house where British officers were sleeping that night. And by the time the sun came up on June 17th, the colonists had built something extraordinary. A redoubt, a roughly square earthwork fortification about 8 feet high, with walls thick enough to absorb cannon fire, sat on the crest of Breed's Hill. Beside it, a long rail fence extended northward toward the Mystic River, reinforced with cut grass stuffed between the rails to break up lines of sight. Behind the rail fence, men crouched with loaded muskets. In a single night, with hand tools, in silence, 1,200 colonists had built a military position on the doorstep of the British Army. When the British sentries spotted it at dawn, the word spread fast. General William Howe stood on the deck of a warship in Boston Harbor and stared. Stop here for a moment. 1,200 farmers, hand tools, total darkness, 1 mile from the most powerful fleet in the world, and they built a fortress overnight. Howe is staring at it from his warship right now, and somewhere in his mind, a question is forming that he has never had to ask before. What happens when you send 1,500 of the best soldiers in the world up that hill? We are about to find out. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because what comes next is the part of this story that Britain spent the rest of the war trying to forget. Howe was 53 years old and one of the most experienced combat officers in the British Army. He had served at Quebec. He had fought across Europe. He had a reputation for personal courage in battle that his men trusted completely. Looking at Breed's Hill that morning, Howe saw a problem, and he saw what he believed was a straightforward solution. The colonists were farmers. They were armed with hunting rifles and a few muskets. They had no artillery to speak of. Their fortification, while impressive for a night's work, was not a professional military construction. And they were colonists. Men who had never stood in a formed line under sustained cannon and musket fire from professional soldiers. They would break. They always broke. The plan was simple. Land troops on the Charlestown Peninsula, form up, march up the hill in disciplined lines, and overwhelm the position. The sight of British regulars advancing in formation would shake the colonists' nerve before the lines even made contact. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Before the assault, British ships and artillery on the Boston side opened a bombardment on the colonial position. Cannonballs plowed into the earthworks. The town of Charlestown, which sat at the base of the peninsula, was set on fire, the smoke rising in a tall black column visible for miles. Inside the redoubt, William Prescott walked along the top of the parapet while the bombardment continued. Not crouching, not taking cover, walking upright so his men could see him. When officers suggested he get down, he said he was showing the men it could be done. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, Howe's force, roughly 1,500 men in the first wave, began their advance up the slope. They were carrying full field packs, 60 pounds of equipment in the summer heat. The grass on the hillside was tall and uncut, the ground uneven, cut through with gullies and stone walls that broke up the neat formations. The men had to pick their way forward as much as march. The colonists watched from behind their earthworks and their rail fence. They held their fire. Prescott and his officers had given a specific order: hold fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. Whether these exact words were actually spoken, or whether they emerged later as legend is debated. But the tactical instruction behind them was real, and it was sound. The colonial muskets were not particularly accurate at long range. Ammunition was limited. Every shot had to count. The British advanced up the slope. They came within range. They kept coming. The colonists opened fire. The effect was devastating. British soldiers in close-packed formations fell by the dozens. The disciplined advance became a stumble, then a halt, then a retreat. Officers tried to rally their men. Some succeeded. The formation reformed at the base of the hill. They charged again. The result was the same. Colonial fire tore through the British lines. Men fell in rows. Officers, who were specifically targeted in colonial fire tactics, dropped at a rate that stripped the units of their command structure. The charge stalled again. 2 charges. 1,500 professional soldiers, twice repulsed by farmers behind an earthwork. Howe later wrote that he had never in his life seen anything like the fire that came from that hill. He described watching the men around him fall until he was, at certain moments, the only officer left standing in his immediate vicinity. He kept walking forward. It was all he could do. For the 3rd charge, Howe stripped his men of their heavy packs. He concentrated his force. He adjusted the attack to focus on the redoubt itself rather than the rail fence. His troops fixed bayonets. The colonists, by this point, were running out of ammunition. They had no reserves, no supply line, no artillery support. When their powder ran low, Prescott ordered them to hold position as long as they could, then retreat in order. Men fought with the butts of their muskets when their ammunition ran out. The British crested the wall of the redoubt and poured in. The colonial force retreated. Joseph Warren, the physician who had asked to fight as a private that morning, was shot through the head near the end of the battle. He was 34 years old. The British held the hill. The numbers, when they were tallied, stunned everyone who read them. Of the approximately 1,500 British soldiers who had advanced up Breed's Hill across 3 charges, 226 were dead. 828 were wounded. Total casualties, over 1,000 men. Roughly 70% of the attacking force had been killed or wounded. Among the dead were a disproportionate number of officers, targeted specifically by colonial fire. 19 officers killed, 70 wounded. The colonial losses were far lighter, around 140 killed, including Joseph Warren. Approximately 270 wounded. The force that had held the hill for hours against 3 professional assaults had lost fewer men in the entire engagement than the British had lost in the first charge alone. Howe sat down that evening and tried to write a report. He did not finish it. What he had witnessed that afternoon was not supposed to be possible. British regulars, trained, equipped, experienced professional soldiers, had been broken twice by colonial volunteers firing from behind earthworks. They had eventually taken the position on the 3rd attempt, but only because the colonists had run out of ammunition. They had not been driven off. They had not broken. They had stood and fired and made the British Army pay a price that nobody in London had imagined paying for a hill in Massachusetts. General John Burgoyne, who observed the battle from Boston, wrote home to England that afternoon. He described the courage of the British soldiers in terms of admiration, and then he wrote something that captured the fundamental shift that had just occurred. He wrote that the conquest of this country would be very far from an easy task. He had expected a show of force to end the rebellion. He now believed the rebellion was something far more serious. Gage wrote to London asking for reinforcements. 20,000 men, he said. The force he had was not enough. King George and his ministers received these reports and chose not to believe them. The rebellion would be crushed. It was simply taking longer than anticipated. But the generals who had been there, Howe, Burgoyne, the officers who had walked up that hill and seen what was waiting for them at the top, they believed it. They had seen it with their own eyes. History books record Bunker Hill as a British tactical victory. The British held the ground at the end of the day. What history books understate is what the battle actually changed. Before June 17, 1775, the dominant assumption among British commanders was that colonial militiamen, however numerous and however motivated, would not stand and fight against professional soldiers in open engagement. The events at Lexington and Concord, the running fight along the road back to Boston, confirmed that assumption. The colonists could ambush, they could shoot from behind stone walls, but stand in a line and absorb a British assault, that was believed to be beyond them. Bunker Hill demolished that assumption in the most expensive way possible. The colonists had not just stood. They had built a fortification overnight under the nose of the British fleet. They had held 3 assaults. They had killed and wounded more than 1,000 of the best soldiers in the world. They had done it with limited ammunition, no artillery support, and no professional training. Howe never forgot what he saw on that hillside. For the rest of the war, his tactical approach was shaped by what happened at Breed's Hill. He became cautious where he had been confident. He preferred flanking maneuvers to frontal assaults. He avoided direct charges against fortified colonial positions. Military historians have argued for 2 centuries about whether Howe's hesitancy after Bunker Hill cost Britain the war. The answer is probably that it did not cost Britain the war alone, but it changed the character of how Britain fought it. Across the water, George Washington received the news of Bunker Hill in Cambridge and drew a conclusion that was the opposite of despair. His army could fight. They had been untrained, outnumbered, and outgunned, and they had made the professional British Army pay a price that no one in the world had expected them to extract. If his men could stand behind earthworks and hold 3 British charges, then with proper training, proper equipment, and proper leadership, what else might they be capable of? The answer to that question would take 6 years to arrive, but it began with what Washington understood on the evening of June 17, 1775, that the men he commanded were not simply volunteers with muskets. They were soldiers. The wider world was watching too. In Paris, French ministers who had been cautiously tracking the American rebellion took note of the casualty figures from Bunker Hill. They had been skeptical that the colonists could sustain a serious military conflict against the British. The losses the colonists had inflicted changed that calculation. Not enough to commit to open alliance immediately. That would require Saratoga, 2 years later, but enough to begin thinking seriously about what supporting this rebellion might be worth. The chain that led from Bunker Hill to the French alliance, to Yorktown and American independence, was not straight or simple. Many things had to happen in between. But the first link in that chain was forged on a hillside in Charlestown on the afternoon of June 17, 1775, when colonial militiamen showed the world that they could bleed an empire. The physical battle lasted about 2 hours. The fortification that 1,200 colonists built in a single night was dismantled by the British almost immediately. Charlestown was burned. The peninsula was occupied. The earthworks that had cost Britain 1,000 casualties were leveled, and within days, the ground looked much as it had before. But the battle itself could not be leveled. Joseph Warren was buried in a mass grave after the battle, his body identified only later and reinterred with honors. He became the Revolution's first major martyr, the physician who gave up everything for the cause before the cause had even fully formed. William Prescott lived through the battle and continued to serve in the Continental Army. He fought at Long Island and at Saratoga. He was never given the recognition his performance at Bunker Hill warranted, which is a pattern that runs through almost every story of the Revolution. The people who mattered most in the early moments being steadily overshadowed by the men whose names the later victories made famous. Howe went on to command the British forces in America for the next 3 years. He took Philadelphia. He wintered comfortably while Washington shivered at Valley Forge, but he never quite pressed his advantages the way his superiors expected him to. And the shadow of Breed's Hill, the memory of what those earthworks had cost, was never entirely absent from his thinking. The monument that stands on Bunker Hill today is an obelisk 221 feet tall, one of the tallest monuments in New England. It took 30 years to build, was funded largely by ordinary citizens who gave what they could, and was finally completed in 1843. Daniel Webster spoke at the dedication. Most people who visit it know the name of the battle. Fewer know that the battle was fought on the wrong hill, that the man who led it was an ordinary farmer from Massachusetts, and that the most important thing that happened there was not the British capturing the position, but the British finally understanding what they were up against. Britain won the hill. The colonists won something more durable. They won the knowledge, confirmed in blood and smoke on an afternoon in June, that they could stand against the best army in the world and make it pay a price it had never expected to pay. That knowledge traveled. It reached Washington. It reached Paris. It reached every colonial volunteer who had wondered, in the months since Lexington and Concord, whether the revolution had any real chance of surviving. After Bunker Hill, the answer was no longer uncertain. It was not going to be easy. It was going to take years and sacrifice and help from France and a long string of disasters before the final victory, but it was possible. Before June 17, 1775, that was not something anyone could say with confidence. After it, they could. Here is what I want you to sit with. Britain sent the best professional soldiers it had up that hill 3 times. 3 times. And the men behind those earthworks, farmers, blacksmiths, shop owners, men who had never fought a formal battle in their lives, made them pay for every yard. Not because they won, they did not win. They ran out of ammunition and retreated, but because they did not break first. There is a difference between being defeated and being broken. Bunker Hill taught Britain the difference at a cost of 1,000 men, and the lesson that the colonists could absorb a frontal assault from professional soldiers and still not break changed the entire calculation of the war. Here is the question nobody has ever fully answered. If the colonists had broken on the first charge, if they had scattered the moment the redcoats began climbing that hill, does the American Revolution survive 1775? Think about it before you answer. Washington had no proof his men could stand. Paris had no reason yet to back the rebellion. The delegates in Philadelphia were still on the fence about independence. Everything that came after Bunker Hill depended on what happened on that hill. But what if it had gone differently? Drop your answer in the comments. Not what you think you are supposed to say, what you actually think. Because that argument has been running for 250 years and nobody has settled it yet. And if this story made you see the revolution differently, share it with one person. Not for the channel, because the story deserves to be heard. Subscribe if you are not already here. The next video covers another moment that history called a defeat, and what it actually was will surprise you. The hill is just where this one happened.